5 Live Formula One.
Hello, after a week off, F1 is back for the Japanese Grand Prix and in a new spring slot. I'm Jenny Gow, and to look ahead to this weekend's action, I'm joined by former F1 driver Jolyon Palmer, F1 journalist Beck Clancy, and the BBC's F1 correspondent Andrew Benson. And Andrew, you've been busy once again. Give us the latest update on Red Bull and Christian Horner.
Yeah, so the Christian Horner controversy rumbles on. This week, the woman who complained about his behaviour has been represented in the media for the first time. A friend of hers spoke to BBC Sport and described the impact that Horner's behaviour had had on her. He used the words upset, angry, scared, intimidated and lonely. In a quite extensive story which you can read about on the BBC Sport website still. One also interesting point that came out of that was that we didn't know this before, but a complaint that she lodged back in December originally was including sexual harassment, which is not a phrase that's been used before. Before, people have been referring to inappropriate and controlling behaviour. So quite a big development on that front. And it's pretty clear that story is not going away for a while, even if there are going to be some lulls from time to time.
Rebecca, can you give us an idea as to why this is important? If someone's saying, oh, what's happened? Surely not much.
Well, we haven't, as Andrew said, we haven't heard from her. She's not actually allowed to speak, which is why we're hearing from a friend and not from her directly. I'm sure she would probably love her say, but is legally not allowed. There's a possibility that it will go to an employment tribunal, but that won't be until next year. So as mentioned, there'll be a lull. If it does go to an employment tribunal, there's a chance that could be public, and then we will find out a lot more detail. Christian Horner we have to be clear, he has denied every single allegation. Red Bull have cleared Christian Horner, but obviously the woman at the centre of this isn't happy with that outcome, isn't happy with the process at hand, and so is continuing to keep this in the media. And I think it's important. I don't think it should be just kind of brushed aside. If she still feels like she's been wronged and she doesn't have a voice, then I think it is important that, you know, there is still a spotlight on this and that we do keep talking about it as and when, not consistently, you know, just as and when there's news and to update. And as Andrew said, he did this story this week with the family friend, using pretty devastating language, I have to say. You know, probably unsurprisingly, she's not in a good place. And I've just had this feeling all along about this story that it got kind of overtaken by this power play at Red Bull between Austria and Thailand and Helmut Marko and Christian Horner. And I think it's too easy to forget the woman at the centre of this. And I think it's really important that we don't do that.
Okay, thanks. If you want to read more about that, BBC Sport website as ever. Jolyon Palmer, back to Japan. And it's springtime. It's what we all wanted, wasn't it? The Japan Grand Prix to take place when it's beautiful. So why has it happened? It's not just because it's beautiful.
Well, everyone's getting very obsessed about these cherry blossoms that you get in Japan in April. Look, everyone's getting very excited about them. I'm going to be honest. I quite like Japan in October time, and it can chuck it down, and it can be a little bit different. The weather forecast for this week is actually looking okay for now, but I think everyone's very excited about the moving of it to cherry blossom season. Should be a cleaner race weekend. That's the idea.
And remind us what this track is like, because Suzuka is a thing of beauty.
Oh, I love it. It's a fast flowing, historic, traditional track with not a huge amount of runoff and a lot of gravel runoff, a bit of grass here and there as well. So it's punishing for the drivers. It's quite narrow. It's very daunting when you're doing your first laps around there. There's a bit of undulation in play. There's some historic corners. You've got the Degners in the middle of the circuit, very easy to catch drivers out. You've got Spoon Curve, a quick and tightening 180-degree double apex corner, which is good. And then you've got the final chicane, which has seen so many historic moments in the previous guise of being a championship decider. It's not going to be that anymore, which is I think is a slight shame for Suzuka, because it feels like that's where it deserves to be for me.
But the thing, Joe, is that it's not been a championship decider for so long because there's so many other races after it now.
2 years ago, it won the championship for Verstappen, though.
Yeah, but that's just not really what you're talking about, is
There's
it?
6 races to go. It doesn't really count. But I know I like the historic tracks being right at the end of the season because there's a bit more of a special feeling. But there is a special feeling for Suzuka wherever it is on the calendar, I'd say.
And the atmosphere back, it's amazing.
Oh, I mean, driver favourite, fan favourite, anyone who works in the paddock favourite. I should say, apart from the jet lag, for me, it's the worst of the year. If you just go out and come back for 5 days, it's horrendous. It's actually one of my favourite tracks to run. We're very privileged in our positions. We get to run the tracks, and for me, even running through the S's is incredible. So I can't imagine, Jolien, what it's like driving through there. That must be pretty special. And then you finish in the grandstand, and because the Japanese fans are so amazing and so committed, they stay all the hours that they're allowed to. So when you finish into full grandstands where they're watching repeats of, I don't know, whatever race from 1992 or, whatever year it was. And they clap every single runner who comes through. And for me, that's amazing. So I can't even begin to imagine as a driver and it's every day, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the stands are full. It's a real party feeling. You've got the wheel that everyone would recognize. It's just amazing. The hats, how they dress up, the costumes. It's honestly one of my absolute favorites of the year.
Gives you a real sense of what it's like to be an elite athlete coming out of the final chicane, being roared on as you're running on foot to the end of the about 5K.
It's the whole experience, isn't it? It's the circuit's amazing, the fans are amazing, and then just Japan is so other, isn't it? It's so unlike anywhere else you go, and even wherever you choose to stay for Suzuka, whether you're in Suzuka and it's kind of a bit mundane around there, or whether you stay a bit further afield in Nagoya, for example, and then you've got quite a trek to get in. Just the experience of flying to Tokyo and getting the bullet train down to Suzuka, if you're fortunate enough to do that, just the whole thing is just brilliant on every level. It's really a race to cherish, and I hope it never ever stops.
Here. But the question is, can anyone challenge Red Bull? Last time out, they had reliability issues. Verstappen did not win. Carlos Sainz did, if you needed remembering. So, Jolien, can anyone challenge this time out?
You know what? I think Ferrari were genuinely way closer in Melbourne than at the previous 2 races. So regardless of Verstappen's failure, it might have been a bit closer. I still think Max would have won the race had he started from the front. He had a brake issue, which was from the first moment of the race. When the lights went out, the rear right brake caliper basically stayed on and was affecting the handling and then the reliability. So you got to rule out Verstappen's race in Melbourne. It wasn't fair even when Sainz passed him for the lead. But you can't rule out Perez's race. And Perez was very ordinary in Melbourne. He struggled to make inroads. When he did get a bit of clear air when Russell pitted in the first stint, he had no better pace. In fact, he had worse pace considerably than Sainz out front. He had worse pace than the McLarens of Norris in second as well. And the context for this is that Perez breezed to second place in the opening couple of races of the season. The caveat is I don't think he's ever really favoured Melbourne. He's a driver that likes Jeddah and likes Bahrain. So maybe it's a Perez weakness rather than a Verstappen weakness. But moving on, I think we could see a similar theme here. Verstappen is very good in Japan, was blitzed pole position last year. Perez struggled a little bit more.
Well, let's hear from Verstappen and what he had to say ahead of this weekend about Red Bull's reliability and the problems they had in Australia.
We saw already some signs on Saturday where things were maybe not looking like they should have done. Of course, then now in hindsight, you can say that it was coming from the brake caliper, but we couldn't find any, let's say, fault with the car, which in a way, I mean, it's of course always bad to retire, but of course when you have a fault in maybe the build spec or whatever, then it's a bit worse. So we'll just move on from there and learn from it. That it doesn't happen again, but normally it shouldn't.
Max, do you have concerns about it coming into this weekend?
No.
Short and sweet. No. So he is now 4 points ahead of his closest rival in the Drivers' Championship, and Red Bull are 4 points ahead of Ferrari in the Constructors' Championship. Andrew Benson, how crucial was that failure to finish for Verstappen last time out?
Not remotely, I don't think. I think he's gonna waltz to this World Championship. He'll win it, the similar sort of time as he won it last year, I think. Ferrari are closer, and actually Ferrari have optimism that they have got an upgrade coming that they will allow them to compete more closely with Red Bull at more circuits. Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz were saying today that Melbourne was very specific in terms of the demands that circuit made on the car. It generated front tire graining. I'm not going to get too boring about tires, but if people remember back to Las Vegas last year, Ferrari were also very competitive. That also was a track that had front tire graining. They seem to struggle less from that than Red Bull do, which they explained. They think that explains why they were closer to Verstappen than normal. But today, they are very much not expecting the same thing to happen in Suzuka. Sainz pointed out that they were 7 or 8 tenths off Red Bull at Suzuka last year. Their car is definitely overall better this year, but they don't think they're going to be able to hold a candle to Verstappen. And I don't think anybody else thinks that either. That doesn't mean it's going to carry on like that all year, but he's so good and that car's so good together that however average Perez is, and he continues to be very much so, I can't see anything other happening over the next sort of third to half a season than Verstappen building a massive advantage that no one else can close for the rest of the season, even if they got competitive with him.
It's a painfully long season, isn't it? And when we're only coming into race 4, I was in Australia 2 years ago when Leclerc left with 43-point advantage over Verstappen. And I mean, it didn't take long to turn that round, did it? And I remember optimistically leaving Melbourne thinking, oh, we've got a great championship battle on our hands. And that didn't last very long. And, you know, the last time Carlos Sainz won was in Singapore last year and Verstappen had a bad race. And I remember going to Japan and Verstappen said, oh, look, I'm just going to crush everyone. It's not going to happen again, is it? And guess what? He went to Japan and crushed everyone. So I suspect, even though it's in a different place this year, that he'll end up in Japan, having lost out in Melbourne, and he'll do it all again. As Andrew says, the car is mostly reliable. That, you know, hasn't had a reliability issue for 2 years. Verstappen is absolutely at the top of his game. He's going to cruise to this championship this year. So it does make it exciting. We get to talk a bit of a championship. Only 4 points between Verstappen and Leclerc, but let's be honest.
Yeah, and also on the reliability thing, the reason Verstappen's not worried is that, as far as I understand it, what happened in Melbourne was that the mechanics forgot to do up the bolts in the caliper. So there's no reason for it to happen again. You know, that was just a mistake. Finger trouble, they call it in Formula One. Red Bull haven't confirmed that officially, but that's what we believe happened. So no wonder he's not worried about it.
Well, at least it means that there's 11 points between the top 4 in the championship for now. At least we can take some solace for the moment. And if Ferrari, I'm just quite impressed with Ferrari, because when you look at where they've come from a few years ago, even 2 years ago, as you mentioned, Beck, when Leclerc was leading the championship by miles, it got overturned so quickly. They are a team transformed. And okay, we still think that Max will be heavy favourite for this weekend on a track that he likes. But I just like that Ferrari could execute a 1-2 race with just Verstappen out the race. That's all that happened. And then they managed to put in the most polished performance. They jumped Norris on the strategy with Leclerc. It was just a very well-managed race from Ferrari. The performance of the car is getting better. Last year, they were so close with Mercedes. Aston Martin started better than them. McLaren ended better than them. But at the moment, they've at least got themselves into that gap between Red Bull and the rest. So I think there's so much optimism for Ferrari, and the fact that it is a long season maybe means that later on they can actually really narrow that gap before we go again next year.
And what about Carlos Sainz? He's put himself into a great shop window, hasn't he, with that win? Bearing in mind, he won last in Singapore. He won before that in Britain. He's on form at the moment.
Is he the best driver this year so far?
Other than Verstappen?
Well, including Verstappen.
I wouldn't include Verstappen in it myself, but do you know what I think is ironic about it is I think, yes, that's probably right. He's maybe the best driver this year so far. And of course, we don't know what would have happened to him in Saudi Arabia, but I'm not sure it's going to have changed very much about his market value. You know, the market is quite fluid at the moment because we don't know whether Verstappen will stay at Red Bull because of the Horner fallout. If he leaves, where's he going to go? The other drivers who are available, you've got Fernando Alonso's on the market as well. And I good as Sainz has been, I don't think that Sainz is going to be a pick for any team above Verstappen or Alonso, just because of the way people perceive the drivers in the paddock. Whether that's fair or not is a subjective opinion, obviously, but I just don't feel that that's the case.
I think he's elevating himself. I disagree. I think he's making a difference right now. And he wants to get this 2025 deal locked in whilst the iron is hot. And it is red hot right now with his podium in Bahrain, win in Melbourne. He's beaten Leclerc the 2 races that he's done. And Andrew, you'd say that Leclerc would be in the creme de la creme of drivers, really. And Sainz is actually beating him. And he was quite close last year. If he can carry this form a few more races, people have got to look at him as not a number 2 driver, but actually a really decent fighter to go amongst the number 1s.
I agree with you, but just because he wants to get his deal done doesn't mean he's going to get his deal done. Look at the teams where he could do a deal. Red Bull, okay, maybe he could sign for Red Bull now if they choose him over Perez. I agree with that. Mercedes. Are Mercedes going to sign him now when they're looking at A, Verstappen, B, Antonelli, the guy in Formula 2 who's their protege at 17, and C, Alonso? Is Sainz going to jump higher up Mercedes' wish list than them? I don't think he is. And then after that, there's no top teams available, apart from maybe Aston Martin. But then that depends on on Alonso, and they've offered Alonso a contract already, which he isn't signing yet. Although he definitely wants to stay in Formula 1, I'm told, despite all this stuff he's saying about, I need to decide. He has decided. It's just a question of where. So that's what I mean about how I don't think it necessarily changes Sainz's marketability, because the market isn't dependent on him. It's dependent on other things.
But maybe it puts the pressure on Alonso.
Maybe.
Because you've got a 29-year-old Carlos Sainz, race winner again, driving really nicely. Does a 42-year-old Fernando Alonso? Can he sit back and bide his time looking at Mercedes, looking at staying at Aston Martin? Or actually, is there a point where Sainz is doing this level of performance? If he does 1 or 2 more races like this, Aston Martin might be like, you know what? We'll take you out then. We'll take the guy that's 13 years younger and winning races right now.
No one's signing a contract until they know for sure what Verstappen's doing, right? Nothing is happening until the summer. I sort of sit somewhere in between you both. I think Sainz, this kind of conversation that he's the most underrated driver and that, he's now showing his true talent, I think is nonsense. I think he's always been highly regarded. He's being replaced by a 7-time world champion. He's not being replaced by a nobody. Everybody rates him. Nobody thinks he's going to be without a drive. He's going to be somewhere on the grid next season. As you say, Andrew, the question is, will it be a top team? Will he miss out on that? Or will he end up maybe a bit lower down the field and take a bit of a gamble, with Sauber, go to Audi, whatever. But no one's sorting out contracts now, because we've seen already this season the surprises that can happen. We also know that contracts don't mean anything in this sport, let's be honest. So I don't think anything's getting signed. I think conversations are going on, as they always do. And managers love to have very open public conversations in the paddock. So I've got no doubt that in Japan, there'll be lots of driver managers running around saying, oh, look who I'm talking to, because that's how it works, puts the pressure on. The only thing Sainz can do is concentrate on himself, on the track. And I do agree with Jolyon on this one. I think he has been the driver of the season so far, coming back after 16 days after having his appendix out, winning in Melbourne. Absolutely brilliant. But I think he's always been good.
Well, let's hear from Carlos Sainz. Has been speaking ahead of this weekend, and of course after that win last time out in Australia.
I think it's important, like I've always said in the past, to turn the page quickly, in the good and in the bad. I think obviously coming from a good is more difficult to turn the page, because you want to stay enjoying the moment. But I turned it on Monday, started focusing my training and being back as fit as possible for Japan. Also because it's going to be a challenging track for us. I think last year was one of our most challenging ones in reference to a Red Bull. We were, I think, 7 or 8 tenths off 4 or 5 months ago here. So it's time to see where we are this year and see if we can be at least closer and enjoy a bit more this amazing track than what we enjoyed it last year, because for me it's one of my favorite ones, if not my favorite.
That was Carlos Sainz, and up next we'll talk Perez, Ricciardo, and could Sebastian Vettel be returning to F1? Welcome back to the Checkered Flag podcast. Andrew Benson. Last time out we were in Australia, and a few drivers didn't have the best of weekends. Starting with Sergio Perez. What's happened to him?
Has anything happened to him? He's always been bang average, hasn't he?
I was thinking the other day, I was writing a section about him, and I thought of all the amazing things he's done, of all those magic moments when he was tyre whisperer and he could get the longest stint out out of a set of Pirellis. And all of that magical quality, much like any other second driver that goes to Red Bull, seems to have evaporated.
So, look, my take on that is that he spent most of his career as a teammate to people who were other midfield drivers. And that's what he is. He's a midfield driver. He's a sort of second rank, very solid, very competent, very good Formula One driver. But he's not A-list. And he's up against one of the best drivers there's ever been in Formula One, in Max Verstappen. And he's getting humiliated. But that's what you kind of would expect. But there are other drivers who are better than him, who could do a better job alongside Verstappen. The only question is, what do Red Bull want in that seat? And if there's a guy called Michael Schmidt, who's a German journalist who's very, very well respected in Formula One. He's been around for donkey's years, even longer than me. And he thinks that Christian Horner wants Fernando Alonso in that car next year. And I don't think any of us on this podcast would think that Fernando Alonso couldn't do a better job than Sergio Perez in that Red Bull, do we?
No.
But would anyone put Alonso? If you were the team principal, would you pick Alonso to go next to Verstappen in your team, Beck?
No, that's a headache waiting to happen, isn't it? I mean, an amazing driver lineup, plenty of world championships between them. They're not going to get on. You're not going to have a number one driver. You're going to have a lot of arguments. You're going to have, I would say, probably collisions on track. I want to see it. Let's go.
So this comes back to the debate of, number one driver, number two driver, blah-de-blah. When you think of legendary teams' performance in the past, I think of, or especially when a team has the best car, they have the best drivers, these are like the iconic moments in Formula One. So you think Senna-Prost, obviously, at McLaren. Hamilton-Alonso at McLaren as well, although neither of them won the championship. But they're big storylines. And then, of course, Hamilton-Rosberg, when Mercedes was so far clear, but the story was so interesting because you had Hamilton v Rosberg and, the fallout between them, the drama. And even if you had Hamilton and Bottas in that time, it's really boring. And we saw a glimmer of it, didn't we, later on, apart from then Ferrari came a little bit stronger and Red Bull came a little bit stronger. So there were other challenges for Lewis. But in the seasons when that didn't happen, it was pretty dull. Hamilton was wiping the floor with everyone. Is it going to be bad PR for Red Bull, if they've got a dominant car, to have two warring drivers or two drivers that are, A-list going at it against each other? Because what are they doing it for? They're in this to win, but for PR, aren't they? For the brand.
Well, they want to sell their drink, don't they? I mean, that's all they really want. And at the moment, Verstappen's barely on the camera because he drives off into the distance and no one ever sees him again. So they'll get a lot more column inches if they had two of the best drivers on the grid in the same team. I completely agree with you, Julian. As I said, I'm all in for it.
Well, the man tipped to come back into F1 and take that place that Perez has is Daniel Ricciardo. And once again, he failed to deliver in Australia. Beck, is he got into his own head again?
Oh, I'm not on the Danny Rick bandwagon, I'm afraid. If you want lots of positive chat about him, I'm the wrong person to ask because it was really sad what we saw unfold in McLaren. It wasn't the driver of old, 8-time race winner. He clearly used to be amazing. I think he got slightly distracted by off track, the marketing, the PR, the messing about. He's not the driver he used to be. I think we're seeing that. I really like him as a bloke because I find this quite difficult. I didn't ever think he was going to take Perez's seat, actually. I always thought that was a bit overhyped. I don't know why they would replace one midfield driver with another midfield driver. I think, as we've previously mentioned, it would be more likely that it would be someone like, Alonso maybe, because quite frankly, your 40s is nothing. I say as someone about to turn 40. So I just, I think we're sort of seeing the real Danny Rick. I don't think he's in his head. I think this is just him.
And Andrew, when it comes to Ricciardo's future in F1, is this a pivotal moment for him, or has he already had that pivotal moment? Now it's just playing out.
Well, he's at real risk at the moment, because if we remember what happened was he came back last year, did a couple of races, broke his hand, got replaced by Liam Lawson for a few races. And Liam Lawson looked very impressive considering he was brand new. And then Ricciardo came back, and the hope at Red Bull was that Ricciardo would beat Tsunoda, his teammate Yuki Tsunoda. That hasn't really happened. Yuki Tsunoda's been beating him now. Helmut Marko, the Red Bull Motorsport advisor, who until this whole Red Bull shenanigans thing and the power play happened, was the guy who decided these things. He doesn't rate Tsunoda. And I think there are people at RB, as it's now known, that think that's a bit unfair. They think Tsunoda's been driving at a pretty high level this year. But be that as it may, if that's Marko's opinion, then it's hard to see how Tsunoda, A, gets into Red Bull, or B, is how Ricciardo can look good not beating him. And at the moment, he's very much not beating him. So I think the bigger risk for Ricciardo at the moment is that he's going to get replaced by Lawson, and that could happen. You know what Red Bull are like. They don't mess about. If Ricciardo doesn't up his game right by sort of Miami time, so we've got Japan, followed by China, followed by Miami. If at Miami he's still struggling to the same extent that he is now, I think he's out potentially, and Lawson could come in. I'm not saying it will happen, but I think there's a real risk of it.
He's definitely under pressure, isn't he? Big pressure. And he knows it now as well, because he's 34. He was brought back for this chance. It was well documented. He even was kind of adding to the story himself, saying the only reason I'm back is to be back in the Red Bull. And I think for Ricciardo, it's one thing being beaten considerably in McLaren by Norris. Norris, I think, is in the top bracket of drivers right now. To come back into a AlphaTauri, RB, and be beaten by Tsunoda, who no one thinks is in the top bracket of drivers, that's the fool that we're experiencing. I think that's why Red Bull and Christian Horner probably thought, bring him back, he'll probably be ahead of Tsunoda, and then that'll put the pressure on Perez, and that's where we're at. But he's actually not ahead of Tsunoda, and he's 34, and that wrist break last year was even worse news for him, because it gave Lawson a chance, and Lawson, 22-year-old Kiwi, was very good when he got in the car, and that's going to be that's obviously the outpull for RB to chuck Lawson in at some point. And I actually think they may be being a little bit harsh on Tsunoda as well. Tsunoda's, you have to say, if Ricciardo's struggling like this in any teammate battle, one guy is being beaten, you're expecting him to be ahead, then you have to look at the other one and say they're doing a great job. Tsunoda is pretty quick, and I wouldn't rule out the chance, or I don't think they should rule out the chance, that he does move to Red Bull if Perez falters in the rest of the year, and maybe Tsunoda deserves a shot. He's driving nicely.
I'm talking of comebacks. Sebastian Vettel, why, Andrew Benson? Is he back on the radar again? I thought he'd quit to spend time with his family and be on a farm, but no.
And the bees at Turn 2 in Suzuka.
Well, it's a really interesting question, isn't it, Jenny? On the surface, the answer is he's got a new drink that he's trying to sell. But in those interviews, he's talked about, maybe thinking about a comeback, but it's not his priority. And today, Lewis Hamilton said he'd be a great replacement for him at Mercedes, although he also said he hadn't been thinking about it before. And he also then said it'd be great if they gave a young driver a chance. I mean, look... he's probably bored, isn't he? Let's be honest. A lot of and the other thing about Formula One drivers who leave is they when they leave, they realize that nothing can ever be the same, and nothing can ever be as good as being in Formula One. And Jolien, you're one of the very few people, I think, who's left Formula
preferring
One
the podcast to the driving.
Yeah, who's had no regrets. But should Vettel come back? I'm just going to throw some stats at you here, okay? I never thought he was as I never thought he was as good as his stats showed him to be, right? So let's just look at his last 2 years in Formula One. In 2021, his average qualifying advantage over Lance Stroll at Aston Martin, or Racing Point, whatever it was called at the time, was 0.13 seconds. In 22, which was the year before he retired, so his motivation's probably gone down a bit, it had gone down to 0.04 of a second. Last year, Fernando Alonso was 0.4 quicker than Lance Stroll. Now, so that's a balanced average of nearly 0.3 that Fernando Alonso is quicker than Sebastian Vettel. Should that Sebastian Vettel come back and get into a Mercedes alongside George Russell? Absolutely not. He'd get destroyed.
And I think that's why I don't think he's particularly serious about a comeback, is my feeling. And it's why I actually had no regrets about leaving Formula One because I felt like I'd achieved the best I could. I had a tricky year and I was out and that was it. I gave my best shot. And I feel like Vettel's another person that is in a very different league, but has given it his best shot. He's a 4-time world champion. He's, technically one of the greats. And even if he didn't have a really tricky year, he had a very underwhelming year, as the stats prove, at Aston Martin. And this is a guy that has won so many races, took records along the way. And then it was just starting to fade away for him. And when you've lived the highs, I think it's difficult for him to come back and be a sort of ordinary midfield driver, which is what I think he probably would be.
I can completely understand him wanting to come back, though, because if you've ever stayed at home and looked after little children, all you want to do is get a job and get out of there. So I definitely don't blame him. And he's made these comments, hasn't he, Vettel, that he's been talking to Toto Wolff, the Mercedes team principal, and you put 2 and 2 together and get 10, and suddenly he's going to replace Hamilton. But we have to remember that Vettel and Wolff, they're extremely good friends. I remember the story back in 17, 18, when Vettel turned 30 and he invited Wolff to his 30th birthday party. And it was at the time that he was battling Hamilton for the championship, and there was a big fallout. And then it was, well, hang on, we speak the same language. We hang out outside of the track and we're actually really good friends. So they do just generally talk to each other. And I think, like you've said, Vettel's a bit bored, and I can't say I blame him. Looking after 3 kids is the hardest job in the entire world. F1 looks easy.
I think also if you're Hamilton, surely there's a part of you that wants to line Mercedes up with underwhelming drivers. And that's maybe harsh to say that might be Vettel, but the stats have borne it out. And why would Hamilton suggest to Toto Wolff who's going to be the best signing they could possibly make when he's off to Ferrari? If I'm off to a rival, I'd be like, take the guy that I think is going to be a bit more average. I think that'd be a great signing for you. Well done. Go and snap him up straight away.
Let's move the subject on to Fernando Alonso. So only slightly on. But talking about his penalty last time out, obviously he was involved in this incident with Russell, ended Russell's race and got penalised. A drive-through penalty that was converted to 20 seconds after the race. Andrew, what are your thoughts on the Alonso debate? Should he have got the penalty? Shouldn't he have?
Well, I'm not going to give an opinion on that, but
come on.
it was unusual driving, but then he says it's not. He says he's perfectly entitled to choose to do what he wants with his racing car when he's trying to hold his position. And I think within reason, most people would agree with him. What's been interesting today is the split of opinion. Nico Hülkenberg was pretty negative about what Alonso did and said he chose the wrong place to do it. George Russell, who was the guy who crashed as a result of, or after Alonso did what he did, said he thought it should be a penalty because otherwise it would open a can of worms. But Lando Norris said no. He described Alonso's driving as so extreme, but he said he didn't think it was even close to being regarded as what Formula One drivers call a brake test, which is slamming on your brakes when someone's right behind you. And he said, should it be a penalty? No. And he actually was saying that it was basically Russell's fault for crashing. He should have been paying more attention. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but that's basically what he meant. So I'd be actually really interested to hear Jolene's view on this, because he's actually raced wheel to wheel with Alonso, and they've had a bit of handbags about it as well, haven't they?
He's actually had me off at that exact corner 5 races into my debut. But I actually am with Norris on this, to be honest. First of all, it's not a brake test, I don't think, from Alonso, because the two cars never came close to touching. And this is what people are getting a bit carried away with, I think, the extent of Alonso's indiscretion. Russell never really got to within a car length of the back of the car ahead. It was just the dirty air that he got close to, and that's what made him lose the car. And this is why it's a real grey area. But I think because Alonso slowed down, I think early enough before the corner, I do think there was a good chance that Russell should have reacted to that and driven differently according to the car in front slowing down. And you might have drivers in front slowing down for various different reasons before a corner. They could have a power unit problem and they back off before the corner. There's so many different things, and that shouldn't mean the car behind immediately crashes. It's complex, and it's a tricky corner. It's a corner that you're always on the edge on anyway. But I think the penalty was harsh. And also, how many times have we seen drivers slowing down before the DRS zones, playing games, braking on the straight. This was erratic driving from Alonso, and by the definition of erratic, it was unusual. It was something he hadn't done before on that corner, and no one else would do or expect. But he did the same thing 4 races ago in Abu Dhabi to Hamilton on a straight, hit the brakes in a very similar way earlier and more surprisingly, and didn't get a penalty, got away with it completely fine. So again, I think it's the different decisions from the stewards, the inconsistency that makes this quite a hard one for the drivers to know exactly where they're at. And then the penalty on top of it is quite a harsh one, I think, 20 seconds for it. So I'm sure that it doesn't surprise me that drivers disagree, because it is a grey area, and that's where Fernando tends to operate, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and Alonso did admit that he tried something different and got it a bit wrong, which I think may have been why the stewards leant towards a penalty. I agree with Jolyon on this one. I thought immediately it was a penalty, and then when you watch the onboard from Russell, like you say, Jolyon, he does seem to have time to respond. It's not like it was completely catches him off guard. And I understand the dirty air, and then he loses control of the car. And I understand Russell being aggrieved and thinking that the penalty should be applied. I found it really interesting, the drivers who said yes and who said no to the penalty, like Norris, for example, who himself has sometimes operated in the grey area. And you have to question, where's the line between letting them race and have their own racecraft to try and get ahead and build an advantage, and then where the stewards get involved. But Jolyon, you and I have spoken about this a million times. There has to be the same stewards at every race. I don't understand why everyone else is expected to go to all the races and they cannot have the same stewards at every race. And then we wouldn't have this issue.
What's interesting about this is that Russell basically admitted today that he was making a switch change on his wheel. So he wasn't looking. So he didn't actually admit, I looked up too late, but that was my inference from what he said, which adds in another dimension to the thing. If he's making a switch change and he doesn't notice the fact that the car's slowed down in front of him, is that, whatever you think about Alonso's behaviour, is that even Alonso's fault? I don't know. I think a lot of people would say, Norris would be probably one of them, it's not. So it's a really interesting topic, and it sounds like it's going to be a really long drivers' briefing tomorrow, because they're all saying we need some clarity on this. Verstappen said we need to talk about this at the drivers' briefing.
And it all just boils down to consistency, because unless there's clarity, and I completely agree, permanent stewards are what you need. So you have a rule book, and because there's a technicality here, according to the rules, Alonso did drive technically erratically because of, he did something different to what he did before. But erratic can be so many different things, and usually, I'm struggling to remember a time where it was punished. So for this one to be punished because the driver behind had a crash that, by the way, looked a lot more dramatic than it actually was, because he bounced back into the road and was sort of halfway up, hanging broadside, I think that all played into the big penalty. But the drivers, when you're driving the car and you're going wheel to wheel or whatever it is, you just need to know the rules of what you can and can't do. You need to get rid of these grey areas as best you can, and a permanent set of stewards that explain what's happened and why the decisions are as they were. That's the best way to solve it.
Okay, we need to move on to any other business, I'm afraid, and talk just briefly about Williams. They hope to have 2 cars. They certainly have 2 chassis to enter into the race. I mean, it was a disaster for them, Beck, wasn't it, last time out? Only having 1 chassis available, not having the spare, having to choose which driver to put in. Embarrassing, a mess, a lack of confidence in one of your drivers. I'm not sure what that will do for his self-esteem. Actually, I can guess what it will do for Logan Sargent's self-esteem. Interesting what the other driver said about it. Max Verstappen said that if he'd been Sargent, he'd have just crashed the car and binned it, and not so Albon couldn't have his car. It was, in the end, they got nothing out of it. Albon finished 11th, so out of the points. A strange position to find themselves in. We're in the budget cap era. They're supposed to have spare parts with them. I think it's kind of a culmination of everything. This part of the calendar being a bit of a mockery, let's be honest. They try and tell us it's because it's eco and geographical, but this gap between Australia and then another week for Japan, another week for China, they just don't have the parts. It's all a bit of a mess. Williams,
I think are in a bit of a mess at the moment, despite what they like to say. Albon is an exceptionally good driver who is outdriving that car. I think he's doing that team wonders, but I don't actually think Williams are in a good place at the moment.
You're absolutely right, Beck. In fact, they've been quite upfront about it. In Bahrain, I went to a breakfast with James Vowles and the team principal and Pat Fry, the chief technical officer, and they basically spent half an hour telling us what an absolute nightmare the winter had been. They're trying to bring Williams up to date. Lots of their operational aspects in the team, including just how they track parts through the factory, for example, which sounds so mundane and trivial, but you can imagine they're talking about in the past, they wouldn't know where a given part was at any one time. They're trying to bring all that sort of stuff up to date. And Vowles has basically admitted that he's taken the team right out to the limit and beyond. And this is a result. So the knock-on effect of all of that is, obviously things get pushed back. And the thing that got pushed back was the third chassis, and it's bitten them in Australia. And Sargent's driving the repaired car in Japan this weekend, and they won't have a spare chassis until the race after China. But it's all a consequence of Vowles trying to modernize the team and get them into a better place. But the consequence of that is that right now, that, as you say, they're not in a good place at all, and they're sort of really up against it.
I feel bad for Sargent, to be honest, in this. Whether or not he should have been retained at Williams was a question last year, but Williams backed him throughout the season. James Vowles put his arm around him, supported him the whole time. And yet 3 races into the year, and he is really shafted. There's no other word for it. He's been shafted by the team. He didn't crash the car in Melbourne. Albon did. Both drivers would have been very aware of the limited parts situation and no spare tub. You're on a street circuit in Jeddah. You're on effectively a temporary street circuit in Melbourne. If the guy crashes in FP1, 11 laps into the weekend, then it is very harsh to take the car from the driver that didn't crash and give it to the guy that's just binned it, no matter if they're better off or they have a higher chance of scoring the points. For morale in the team and the garage, I think that's really tough for Sargent to get over. And on top of that, he now has the repaired chassis, which he didn't even crash for the next 2 races. There might be stiffness questions, but there will be weight added to that chassis as well.
100 grams apparently is the weight added. So the thing is, Jolien, I agree with you. It is harsh on Sargent, but again, I heard James Vowles explain the decision in Australia, and I don't. Formula One is big boys stuff, right? You don't get treated with kid gloves. The bottom line is they're in a battle for points. There's 5 teams. The way Formula One is at the moment, there's 5 teams at the top and 5 teams at the bottom, and there's kind of a gap in between with RB threatening to maybe bridge that gap a little bit. So if those 5 teams, which are Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin and McLaren, not in that order, apologies to McLaren there, if they all finish their cars, there's no points for anybody else. So all the other teams are very aware of that. And Vowles was thinking, we really need to get these odd points here and there. Otherwise, we're really stuffed. And is Sargent going to get them that point? Absolutely not. Is Albon definitely quicker than him? Always. So, even if they're close in qualifying, Albon's always quite a significant distance ahead in the race. So while it's tough on Sargent, and you're right about being backed and all the rest of it, and should he have kept his seat and all the rest of it, and he probably shouldn't actually on the face of it, on the balance of his performances last year, what other decision was James Vowles realistically expected to make in those circumstances?
No, I get it in the sense of it's a business, it's a championship, they want maximum points. But I was actually going to ask Jolien, having previously mentioned I'm not an elite sportsman and you were, if when you were driving and this had happened and you were asked to give up your car, what would you have done? Would you have binned it? Would you have given it over? Would you have thrown what do you do in this circumstance?
Well, you have no choice. You cannot bin the car so that the other guy can't have it. You have absolutely no choice. And this is why, Sargent, as magnanimous as he was in Melbourne, there is no choice. The team don't want you to race. They pay you, and they don't want you to race the car. They'd rather the other guy race. So you have to give it up. But then just psychologically for him, who was already in a frail position because of where he was last year, he's trained, worked hard, starting a fresh season. That is just such a tough decision for Williams to make. And I think it's just a bit short-termist from Williams, particularly in Melbourne when they had one car. Albon didn't score points, and that was with neither Mercedes finishing the race. Verstappen didn't finish the race. Alonso had a drive-through penalty. Bottas was ahead and had a 30-second pit stop. So really, they were quite a long way away from scoring that point in any normal world, with enough happening that he finished 11th. But all of that is quite a heavy psychological cost. You've added in the fact that Sargent did 34 more laps than Albon on the Friday. He did a quali sim in FP2. He did a long run in FP2. Albon was coming into Saturday basically blind on the performance of the Williams because he had only run a medium tyre at the start of FP1 on a green track. And they still think that he's the better candidate. Probably he was. Maybe he probably was because of the performance difference. But what does that say for Sargent? And then it does beg the question, if you've got that little confidence in him, why did they sign him? They've lost the justification, any justification to sign him as a second driver when he's got all that advantage coming into the weekend, and he held the trust of the team and didn't crash the car, and yet you're still giving it to the other guy. And we're not talking about Verstappen in the other seat. We're talking about Albon.
Look, if you're not living on the edge in F1, you're taking up too much room. Right, thank you to all our guests, Beck Clancy, Jolyon Palmer and Andrew Benson. You can listen to the Japanese Grand Prix on 5 Live. The race is on Sunday morning with coverage starting from 5:45. You have been listening to an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live.